In the end, can there be any sort of deal that backs Russia off that does not include Russia's concerns and take into consideration Russian concerns when it looks at the Ukraine, it sees Western intervention, it saw top U.S. officials out before the president was ousted and fled to Russia. There were top U.S. officials on the streets in Kiev supporting the demonstrators. So Putin looks at this and says the West is, interfering in sort of my neighborhood. So doesn't Putin's ties to perceived or real to the Ukraine and to Crimea have to be considered if there's to be a diplomatic solution? Senator Durbin.
Well, let me say, from my point of view, I agree with Lindsey when he talks about missile defense and strengthening NATO alliance. Now, let's be honest about it. The Crimea has been in a crucible for decades, if not centuries, over its identity and its future. And it was the Ukrainian government that invited the Russian government to establish a base agreement in Crimea. That complicates it, as does the ethnic breakdown within that region. But we've got to make it clear to Putin that if there are Russian-speaking people on the soil of another nation, that doesn't give him license to invade to protect them when there's no obvious threat against him. Because there are Russians spread all over the former Soviet empire there, in countries that are today very free, very democratic, and very friendly to the United States. We've got to draw the line.
Senator Graham, I want to read you something from Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur. She is part of a Ukrainian caucus on Capitol Hill, a Democrat from Ohio, in which she said in an interview, if I was President Putin, I would have been worried with the collapse of the Party of Regions, that is the government in Kiev, about peace in the Crimea. I understand Russia's military posture. This obviously runs counter to anything either you or Senator Durbin is saying right now. What do you make of that position, that there is a Russian view to this that is not totally understood or taken into account?
It's a horrible position for an American political leader to take to legitimize what's happening. The Crimea is part of the Ukraine. In 1994, there was an agreement as the former Soviet Union split up. And by the way, Putin's trying to create a new Russian empire in which it stand up. The Crimea is complicated, but it is part of the Ukraine. In 1994 agreement, the Ukrainians gave up all nuclear weapons to maintain territorial sovereignty. This is not the way to influence a democratic state. Yes, people in Kiev need to understand Eastern Russia has its complications, but nobody in the world, including a member of Congress, should legitimize using 15,000 troops to invade a country to have your say about what's going on regarding your neighbor. This is an invasion. The Crimea is part of the Ukraine. This is not the way you settle disputes. Can China go in and take islands away from Japan? The Iranians are watching. If we do not decisively push back against Putin and make him weaker and all of our friends in the region stronger, the Iranians are going to misunderstand yet again we mean it regarding their nuclear program. So much is at stake. Putin's on the wrong side of history. He's on the wrong side of the law. Make him pay a price. The Ukrainian people are dying for their freedom. I hope we will stand with them, not just in words, but in deeds.
Senator Durbin, your reaction to what Congresswoman Kaptur had to say?
Well, I disagree with Marcy. I think we need to be sensitive to the Russian populations in Crimea. As I've said, this is an historic reality. But the notion that Putin can send in, as Lindsey Graham says, 15,000 troops or whatever the number in order to so-called protect them just defies the sovereignty of Ukraine, and especially the point he made. An agreement which the Russians were signatories to back in 1994. So I would say to my friend Congresswoman Kaptur, we can be sensitive to the Russian reality in Crimea, but don't give license to Vladimir Putin to invade this sovereign nation.